Welcome to today's discussion, where we're diving into Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher, a text that's as provocative as it is illuminating. Fisher's work is a cornerstone for understanding not just the ideology of capitalism, but the ways it manifests in our daily lives, shaping how we think, act, and even imagine alternatives. His central thesis can be summed up in a phrase he borrows from Fredric Jameson and Slavoj Žižek. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. This chilling observation isn't just a critique of the economic system. It's a diagnosis of our collective psyche, a look at how deeply capitalism has infiltrated our social, cultural, and even psychological fabric. Let's start with Fisher's definition of capitalist realism. For him, it isn't merely a political or economic system. It's an all-encompassing atmosphere, a cultural logic that presents capitalism as not only the dominant system, but as the only possible one. It's a kind of ideological fog that makes alternative futures seem not just unattainable, but unthinkable. Fisher draws heavily on the concept of ideology as theorized by Althusser and Lacan, understanding it as something that operates not just in the realm of ideas, but in the structures and practices of everyday life. Capitalist realism embeds itself into the mundane. Workplace policies, popular culture, educational systems, making its presence seem natural and inevitable. One of Fisher's most compelling examples of capitalist realism is the pervasive sense of reflexive impotence that defines contemporary life. Reflexive impotence is the feeling of knowing that something is wrong, that the system is unjust or unsustainable, but simultaneously feeling powerless to change it. This isn't just apathy. It's an active acknowledgement of the problem coupled with a resignation to its inevitability. Fisher illustrates this through popular culture, particularly in films like Children of Men. In this dystopian narrative, the collapse of society is depicted not as a dramatic overthrow, but as a slow decay, a mirror of how we often experience modern capitalism, as something that erodes possibility rather than explosively destroys it. Fisher also critiques how capitalism co-opts dissent and alternative visions, a point where his thought intersects with theorists like Herbert Marcuse and his concept of repressive tolerance. Capitalism, Fisher argues, is remarkably adept at absorbing critique. He cites the example of Kurt Cobain and the grunge movement, a subculture that once symbolized rebellion, but was quickly commodified and turned into just another market niche. This, for Fisher, exemplifies capitalism's ability to transform even its fiercest critics into components of its machinery. It doesn't suppress opposition outright. It commodifies it, rendering it harmless and even profitable. A crucial element of capitalist realism is its effect on mental health. Fisher connects the rise of conditions like depression and anxiety to the neoliberal emphasis on individual responsibility. Under capitalism, systemic issues, like economic precarity or job insecurity, are reframed as personal failures. If you're struggling, it's because you're not working hard enough, or you're not resilient enough. Fisher calls this privatizing stress, where collective issues are individualized, leaving people isolated and alienated rather than united in solidarity. This, of course, aligns with the broader neoliberal project, which seeks to dismantle collective institutions like unions or welfare systems in favor of personal responsibility. To reinforce Fisher's critique, let's draw on Žižek's idea of the ideological fantasy. Žižek argues that ideology works not by concealing reality, but by framing it in ways that make its contradictions bearable. Capitalist realism functions similarly. It doesn't deny the existence of inequality or ecological collapse, but frames them as unavoidable side effects of progress. It offers just enough room for critique to let us vent, but not enough to affect real change. Think about the endless stream of dystopian movies and TV shows, Black Mirror, for example. These narratives let us acknowledge the horrors of our current trajectory, but they also reassure us that these horrors are distant, hypothetical. They allow us to confront our fears in a way that feels cathartic, but ultimately leaves the status quo untouched. Fisher doesn't just diagnose the problem. He also gestures toward its resolution, albeit tentatively. He suggests that one way to combat capitalist realism is by reclaiming the collective imagination. This involves not just dreaming of alternatives, but actively constructing spaces where those alternatives can take root. Here, Fisher's thought resonates with Ernst Bloch's concept of the not yet, the idea that the seeds of a better world already exist in the present, waiting to be cultivated. For Fisher, this means looking to the margins, to the cracks in the system where new possibilities can emerge. Education plays a central role in this project. Fisher critiques the neoliberalization of education, where schools and universities are increasingly modeled after businesses, prioritizing metrics and marketability over critical thought. He argues that education should be a space for what he calls popular modernism, a fusion of accessibility and intellectual rigor that can empower people to challenge capitalist realism. This isn't about retreating into academic elitism, but about fostering a critical consciousness that's grounded in everyday experience. In this sense, Fisher's work is deeply hopeful, despite its often grim tone. He believes in the possibility of rupture, of breaking through the ideological fog of capitalist realism. This requires collective action, yes, but also a shift in how we perceive the world. It means rejecting the idea that there is no alternative, and instead embracing the idea that alternatives are not only possible but necessary. To fully appreciate Fisher's contribution, it's useful to situate him within a broader intellectual tradition. His critique of capitalism as an all-encompassing system owes much to Foucault's concept of biopolitics and Deleuze and Guattari's theory of control societies. Like Foucault, Fisher sees power as something that operates diffusely, shaping not just institutions but individual subjectivities. And like Deleuze and Guattari, he recognizes the role of desire in maintaining systems of control. Capitalist realism doesn't just impose itself through force. It seduces us, promising convenience, comfort, and freedom even as it restricts our horizons. Fisher's analysis also dovetails with the work of Antonio Gramsci, particularly his concept of cultural hegemony. Capitalist realism isn't just an economic phenomenon. It's a cultural one, maintained through art, media, and everyday rituals. It's why Fisher spends so much time analyzing popular culture, from Hollywood blockbusters to reality TV. These aren't just distractions. They're mechanisms for reproducing capitalist logic, for making its contradictions feel normal and inevitable. Building on the radical potential Fisher outlines, let's delve deeper into the mechanisms by which capitalist realism sustains itself, focusing on its relationship with temporality, technology, and the ecological crisis. These facets of Fisher's critique highlight not only the pervasiveness of capitalist realism, but also the points at which it might be most vulnerable. One of Fisher's key insights is how capitalism manipulates our experience of time. Drawing on the work of thinkers like Jacques Derrida and Franco Berardi, Fisher explores how neoliberal capitalism warps our sense of temporality into what he describes as a kind of timeless present. Under capitalist realism, the future becomes foreclosed. Alternative systems of social organization are rendered unthinkable, and the future is reduced to an endless extension of the present. This idea is most evident in the phenomenon of hauntology, a term Fisher borrows from Derrida. Hauntology describes the persistence of past cultural forms in the present, not as living traditions, but as ghosts, specters of unrealized futures. Fisher illustrates this through the stagnation of popular culture. He points out that contemporary music, film, and fashion often recycle past aesthetics rather than creating something genuinely new. For instance, the resurgence of retro trends, 80s synthwave, 90s grunge revival, or the obsession with reboots and sequels in Hollywood, signals a cultural moment unable to envision a forward trajectory. This slow cancellation of the future, as Berardi calls it, reflects capitalism's inability to innovate beyond its own limits. It traps us in a loop where nostalgia for the past displaces the possibility of a transformative future. Technology, Fisher argues, plays a dual role in this process. On one hand, it reinforces capitalist realism by perpetuating a culture of immediacy and distraction. Social media platforms, for example, commodify attention and encourage a cycle of consumption that keeps us tethered to the present. Fisher critiques this semio-capitalism, where signs and symbols are monetized as a key feature of contemporary capitalism. On the other hand, technology holds the potential to disrupt capitalist realism by creating new forms of collectivity and consciousness. Fisher is keenly aware of this dialectical tension. While technology often serves capitalist ends, it also harbors the seeds of its own transcendence. This tension is especially evident in the context of the ecological crisis. Fisher argues that climate change represents a direct challenge to capitalist realism because it reveals the system's inherent contradictions. Capitalism's imperative for infinite growth is fundamentally incompatible with the finite resources of the planet. Yet, rather than confronting this reality, capitalist realism responds with denial, displacement, or superficial gestures of green capitalism. Fisher critiques the neoliberal approach to environmentalism, where individual consumer choices, like buying reusable bags or electric cars, are framed as the solution, while systemic change is ignored. Here, Fisher's analysis intersects with the work of Naomi Klein, particularly her critique of disaster capitalism. Both Klein and Fisher recognize that the capitalist system is structurally incapable of addressing the ecological crisis because doing so would require limiting profit and growth. Fisher goes further, however, by exploring how the psychological mechanisms of capitalist realism, its reflexive impotence and foreclosure of alternatives, compound the problem. The result is a collective inertia, a sense that even as the planet burns, there is nothing we can do but continue along the same destructive path. But Fisher's work is not without hope. He insists that the very crises capitalism produces, economic inequality, mental health epidemics, ecological collapse, also create opportunities for rupture. These moments of breakdown, Fisher suggests, can be moments of breakthrough if they are seized upon to imagine and construct alternatives. This is where the role of the collective imagination becomes crucial. For Fisher, imagination is not merely a matter of individual creativity, but a social force, a collective capacity to envision and enact new possibilities. To cultivate this imagination, Fisher emphasizes the importance of creating spaces outside the capitalist logic. This might mean reinvigorating public institutions like libraries, universities, and community centers as sites of critical thought and collective action. It could also involve reclaiming digital spaces from corporate control, using technology to build networks of solidarity rather than perpetuate cycles of consumption. In this, Fisher's vision resonates with the anarchist traditions of mutual aid and direct action, as well as with Marxist calls for systemic change. Let's pause to consider a broader philosophical parallel. Fisher's insistence on the necessity of collective imagination aligns with Ernst Bloch's idea of concrete utopia. Unlike abstract utopias, which are idealistic and detached from material conditions, concrete utopias are grounded in the real possibilities of the present. For Bloch, the seeds of utopia are always already embedded in the contradictions of the current system. Fisher, too, believes that alternatives to capitalism are not only possible, but latent within the system's own failures. It's a matter of uncovering and cultivating them. Fisher also draws inspiration from Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the lines of flight that exist within any system of control. These lines of flight represent potential escapes, moments where the system's contradictions open up new paths of resistance and transformation. For Fisher, these might include grassroots movements, artistic experimentation, or even the repurposing of capitalist technologies for emancipatory ends. The task, as he sees it, is to identify and amplify these lines of flight, turning them into tangible alternatives to capitalist realism. In the end, Fisher's critique of capitalist realism is not just a diagnosis of the present, but a call to action. He challenges us to confront the ideological fog that surrounds us, to recognize the ways in which it limits our imagination, and to actively work toward breaking through it. This requires more than critique. It demands creation. Fisher's ultimate message is one of empowerment. While capitalist realism seeks to convince us that there is no alternative, Fisher insists that alternatives are not only possible but necessary. It is up to us to bring them into being. Thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this video and explore the ideas of Mark Fisher with me. I truly appreciate all of your support, thoughtful comments, and the vibrant discussions we've been having here. Your feedback and engagement not only make this journey worthwhile, but also create a space where we can collectively challenge the status quo and imagine new possibilities together. To all of you who've subscribed, liked, or shared these videos, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It means so much to know that these ideas resonate with you and that we're building a community dedicated to critical thought and meaningful change. Until next time, take care and keep imagining a better future.